What is up, my friends? Welcome to the Role Clarity Roundup. Today's going to be all about what does it mean to be a youth leader, youth minister, youth pastor, whatever word you want to put there. I can't wait to ask my guest this question. But my own experience with youth ministry is that this is one of the first places that people kind of get their feet wet, or their first experience leading in a ministry, either that's paid or volunteer, which means for me, it's a critical position for us to figure out how do we raise up young leaders, positioning people to succeed. A lot of people have, I think, vague expectations about what does it mean to be a youth leader and how to thrive in that position. But before I get off on a tangent, this is a part of a series where we're talking with local church leaders and people who understand the local church ministry about key roles that people have to fill and how do we get clarity around what those roles should look like. How do we communicate better with team members and also team members with us as leaders? I want to get right into it. My guest is James.warren. James, first of all, if you see this up here on my forehead, this big cut right here, last night, a brutal game of Nerf basketball with the kids. I was slammed into a bookcase. So talking youth ministry and a huge gash on my forehead just feels like, right on par for what we got going on here.
The real question, though, is did you win?
I was thinking back this morning because it's one of those moments where literally I kind of had little stars. And later I was like, I don't know what just happened, but I was thinking, did it go in? Did the shot go in? Because I was trying a trick shot. Yeah. Two kids attacking at the same time. And so my wife just walked in, just shook her head. She's like, I'm out of this whole experience. Yeah. So, which brought back so many memories of me and my brother. We had some hardcore Nerf basketball games. Yeah. So it's on the back of the door. It's still there. But yes, this is the sign, the war wound that I'm carrying with me today.
Well, I am proud of you. I am proud of you.
Thank you. We got to stay strong. Even at 40, I'm still going for it. So you are a consultant with Ministry Architects, but you also were in youth ministry for 15 years. Just so we get started, I'd love for you to just let people know kind of a little bit your story, but then also what do you do for Ministry Architects? How do you serve churches and leaders? Because I think that speaks to how you're going to be able to help have a great conversation today.
Haley, thanks for having me. My name is James.warren. I'm in today cloudy Virginia Beach. Mostly, I like to say sunny Virginia Beach, but it's not. So I was a youth pastor here for 13 years. Prior to being in Virginia Beach, I was at a church plant in Richmond, Virginia, for 2 years. I went on with them 3 months before launch, and then was there for my senior year of college. Like all student pastors, I got my degree in physics with a minor in computer science and math because that's super helpful. But somewhere in that journey, the Lord called me to ministry, and I love learning the other things. I really think it helped me square up and get ready for the job I do today. But I didn't want to do physics or science or math. I wanted to be with people and do kingdom things. And so that's, again, why I'm excited to be here today to talk kingdom things. So like I said, I was a youth pastor for 13 years here in Virginia Beach. You would think it was a non-denom church. And so we'll just go with that for all kinds of reasons.
Yes.
And so in 2019, I went on sabbatical, and the first 5 days of my sabbatical, the Lord made it pretty clear to me that my time at the church I was at was coming to an end. But instead of telling me what was next, he said, well, for now, be faithful to the now, and we'll display the next later on. So I went back to work, faithful to the now. In December of that year, he made it pretty clear it was time to say goodbye to the now and explore the next. And so I didn't know what that meant. And so I resigned January 1st out of obedience. I was going to do software consulting, computer science. And then I've been working with Ministry Architects for about a year. And so I was going to combine those two things to make a full-time job. And then the pandemic hit, and nobody wanted a consultant, right? Just out of nowhere, there was this world shutdown. And so I was a stay-at-home dad for 3 months. And in that time, I created a startup doing virtual events with some friends. And so what I tell people is I successfully ran a failing startup for 2 years. We've since shut that down, and now I just do Ministry Architects full-time.
Okay.
And so, I love what I do with Ministry Architects. I get to kind of play a few different roles that I think are valuable for our conversation today. One is I help churches find staff members. So right now, I'm doing 3 searches for churches. an associate pastor, a high school pastor, a middle school pastor, and I just got an email today about a fourth one in Georgia for a teaching pastor for youth ministry. So really working with them to define
Okay.
what they want out of that role and helping them get that. So that's part of what I do, and the other part of what I do is just pure consulting. Um, we really have a heartbeat for helping churches create healthy systems because we believe that with healthy systems, you can then become innovative and change things. The church today doesn't look like it did yesterday, and the church of tomorrow doesn't look like it does today. And so, uh, to sustain and grow and keep doing kingdom things, we've got to be innovative. And so, healthy systems allow us to be innovative, and innovation allows us to live into the future of the church. And so, one of the things, ministry architects, we use the building analogy, right? Like I don't care what kind of house you want to build. Your house needs to have a foundation. Your house needs to have load bearing walls. It needs to have the plumbing done correctly. So all of those things that we would say are probably systems. You can build any house you want with the right systems. And we
Yeah.
believe, and I believe, you can build any ministry you want with the right systems. And just like in a house, load bearing wall, foundation, like those systems are universal. Size, denomination, practice don't matter. There are some systems you need in place to be healthy and innovative and move into the future. So that's what I do. I coach, I travel, I work with churches, I have conversations like this. And it just gets me excited to make friends and do kingdom things. So again, thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I love that we both have a Virginia Beach connection. I spent some time there, and a big fan of Virginia Beach. And I'm just so excited because this is a kind of a different conversation than one I've got to have before, because you interact with a lot of ministry leaders, but you're serving them. And so to me, the perspective, even our first conversation, perspective that you have is going to be, I think, going to be really beneficial today. But let's just jump into it. Our challenge for today is to land at what we consider to be the 4 key roles for a youth minister. I always say this is not to end all conversations. We are not like the
Right.
authoritative writing the textbook here. But my hope always is that like we've opened up some conversations. So if there's people that are
Right.
watching, someone's looking to say, I like that, but I might think about this differently. I think that's a win. I think,
Yeah.
for me, clarity is a win. And so if our conversation is able to help them have better conversations, then I'm all for it. And maybe speaking to a church leader who's wondering, like, man, I've hired a couple youth ministers, and I feel like maybe I've kind of missed it a couple times. I'm not
Mm.
sure how to do it. And 2023 looks different than the guy I hired in 1995, and so just helping them think through that, and also for maybe the person looking at youth ministry. I won't get ahead of us, ourselves, but I know even you said that it looks different. Things look different now.
Yeah.
Hiring this position 20 years ago is different, and so it's important, I think, that we're talking about it. I also want to say for everybody watching, we understand that there are different ministry contexts, and so we'll try to kind of morph our conversation to how does this look for a church that's a small church versus a large church. I mean, you just referenced that you're hiring a lot of different positions, so you can speak to some of that. But we'll do our best to kind of cover those different scenarios where possible. But to get us started, I want to do the opposite. Everybody says they want to stay out of the weeds. We're diving right into the weeds to start,
I'm
James,
in.
with because this. I always think people say they don't want to dive into the weeds, but they get frustrated when the weeds aren't getting handled and the tasks aren't getting done. And so let's just step back. You hear a lot about this, so you'll be great taking the lead of when people are hiring a youth minister. What are the things that they say they want to see them doing on a weekly basis or a
Yeah.
monthly basis? I mean, what does that list look like?
Well, it's interesting because it depends on who you ask, how you ask, and when you ask, right?
Okay.
And what I mean is, if you ask the senior pastor or an executive pastor or associate pastor, they have a list of things that they want that youth pastor to do. If you ask a group of parents, they have some holistic things that they want that youth pastor, youth director to do. And if you ask an individual parent one-on-one or students one-on-one, what they want, like the no list is going to be the same.
Yeah.
And so I think that's interesting. Common themes. Everybody wants somebody who's organized, who can communicate really well, who is socially engaging, who can be the life of the party, but also have deep conversations, who spends time on high school campuses, middle school campuses, who's good at recruiting volunteers, who can step in on a Sunday morning and teach if necessary, who can lead a small group, right? And I can keep going because the list never seems to
Yeah.
end. It is just
Yeah.
amazing at the things that we expect one single person to do.
Yeah.
And again, each person has their own list, but I would say each person's list, unless they really spent time with somebody fine tuning that list, when they start is unrealistic, if you ask me.
Which I love that you hear that, because you said that you actually do this. You sit down with teams, and I've
Yeah,
done this in certain situations. It's like, hey, just start making the list for me of all the things of what this person would do. And I'm guessing the list is even longer than what you've said thus far. I mean, as far as literally the task that they would want to
yeah.
see when they're walking around the hallways at on the campus or coming to a service on those nights.
Well, so it's interesting because it's not only like when we ask these questions, it's not only the task list. So we get the task list and we write it down. And then I go back and I say, okay, how many hours a week should they spend preparing for a message to give once a week?
Okay.
Okay, this many hours. Okay, how many hours should they spend writing cards to new people? How many hours should they spend on high school campuses at sporting events, chorus concerts? How many hours a week should they spend taking middle schoolers out for a baseball game? Like how many hours? And so I just ask all of this. At the end of the list, we often are in 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110 hours a week. Like it's like there's no clear expectation
Yeah.
that we've really decided on. And so what happens in the hiring process, churches will hire somebody with these expectations that are unrealistic and then get frustrated when they don't meet them. And
Yeah.
again, youth will be frustrated, parents will be frustrated, senior leadership will be frustrated, but they'll all be frustrated for different reasons because they expect this youth pastor or leader to be aiming at different targets. And she's not hitting any of the targets because
Yeah.
nobody's really clarified what the one target is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So I have to ask you though. So when you go through this practice and even if let's just get to 60, 65 hours,
Yeah.
what's the response when you look at somebody and say, "So we just added this up." What's the response you hear? Just because I believe when it comes to all ministry, but youth ministry, I think is one in particular that has just grown with the explosion of what's expected
Yeah.
of them. What's the response you get whenever you kind of go through that exercise?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Depends on the pace of life of the church. Uh,
Okay.
some churches run at a really fast pace all the time, and it's expected that their staff will work 50, 55 hours a week. Um, and so for those churches, it is still an aha moment because they're over that 55 that they would say 50, 55, what they would say is normal for their senior staff. Um, and then some churches don't run at that pace. And as we get to 60, 70 hours, it's this aha moment of we really do need to
Yeah.
shave back the expectations. And that's where we come in and really help them name those things. Like,
Yeah.
what is it that only this person can do?
Yeah.
Because that's really what you need them to do. We can get volunteers, we can get students. Like there are things we get other people to do, but we're paying this person to do something specific. Let's name that
Yeah.
and then go from there.
To me, even though I probably have done that exercise in a little bit of a different way, but it still comes back to, okay, so if we land at they can't do all, there is no superhuman that's going to do all of these
Right.
things and have, especially if you expect them to have any kind of healthy spiritual life and all of that that you want them to have too,
Yeah,
quietness with God
marriage,
and all this
boundaries, all of
marriage.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It helps to really refocus of, okay, what matters most, which is one of my favorite conversations, is to actually turn this back to, what matters most. And so, which I think we're kind of making this segue already to this next section. So we get this big task list, and we know that it's about relationships with students and volunteers and speaking and other staff responsibilities and all of that. So for you, from your experience, if you were to look, and one of the challenges I always give team leaders is, let's land at 4 buckets, 4 key roles. That's all you get, and that's kind of one of my filters for stopping some of this bloat that begins happening whenever we
Yeah.
start talking about positions. Is, okay, we got 4 key roles, and you can make those roles really broad and wide. You can make them really specific. That's more of what you want, but each of those come with a time allocation, whatever. So for you, from your experience and what you've seen, if you were looking at what you consider to be the 4 key roles for the average youth pastor, somebody's looking to hire one,
Yeah.
what are some of the ones that you think could potentially fill those 4 buckets for you that fill their time?
Yeah. So I think my four would be this. Bucket one is students. uh, no brainer for youth ministry.
Yeah.
Bucket two is volunteers. Bucket three is parents. And bucket four is other duties as assigned, which
Yeah.
is the catch all. Nobody ever wants to see
Yes.
that at the end of their resume or at the end of
Yeah.
a job. But like being on a team, there are other things
Yeah.
that we're going to have to do.
Absolutely.
And so I would go, those are my four. We need to spend time with students. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, developing spiritual capital and relational capital. We need to spend time with volunteers. We need to spend time training volunteers, leading volunteers, coaching volunteers, because the ministry stopgap is going to be the number of adult volunteers that we can get investing in kids. Um, I can't do for 20 what I can do for five. And if I can do that for five volunteers, then they can effectively do that for 20.
Yeah.
So students, volunteers, and then parents. I have found that I don't care how great your ministry is. If parents don't trust you or don't feel like you're communicating with them, you're not going to get their kids. And so, on some level, you need to spend time investing in relationships, empowering, equipping, teaching, and leading parents to be the lead discipler and head of their household. And
Yeah.
as you do that, you'll get the kids. So the big three for me would be students, leaders, parents, and then other things it means to be on a team. And so I think that can fill. For me, it'd be a minor bucket, right? Like,
Yeah.
but I think we need to name that I'm going to be a team player
Yeah.
as a senior staff member, as a youth director. I'm going to take this role seriously,
Yeah.
and I'm just going to help the team any way I can, whether it's children's ministry because that's valuable, adult ministry,
Yeah.
teaching, programming, whatever it is that I can do and bring my gifts to the table. Other duties as assigned will help my youth ministry flourish. So those are my
Yeah.
four buckets.
Okay, so because the one that jumps out to me is, and maybe this is just the environments that I have been in. I want to be the first to admit that, and you can speak to this. Is to me one thing too is the expectation of a weekly youth service or whatever has to me has heightened over my old days in youth ministry of what I would consider a Wednesday night classic youth
Yeah,
service. And so for me, of course, I would be surprised there as far as just not if that for you that not being one of the major buckets is putting on just the amount of time that they're putting into getting ready to speak to putting on a service. What we did for me, help me. What are the expectations people have for weekly services at this point? Is that a common theme, or is that kind of fading away a little bit?
again, I think it's so contextual.
Okay.
I, I'm working with a church uh, in Texas that they do a weekly Sunday night thing, but they also have Sunday school in the mornings, and so that's part of the model. I'm working with a church in Nashville that they've moved to a midweek program. What the vehicle they use, I
Yeah.
think, is not as important as the destination they're heading. Right?
Yeah.
Churches want students to feel loved, valued, and to be discipled is kind of the themes that I'm seeing. And
Okay.
the vehicle they use to do that, it may be a big attractional Wednesday night service.
Yeah.
It may be a group that meets off campus midweek in a home. It depends
Okay.
on the church and their kind of strategy.
Yeah. Which I think one of the ways that I walk through this process with like the four buckets and what I'm always challenging, just giving a quick summary to you and then to anybody watching is I always say because sometimes what you'll hear is people really I want somebody who's really great at this, and so you start talking about specialists like people doing really great stuff with parents. What I'd say is like then you need those buckets to fill a bigger percentage of their time, and a lot of times what you look at is those buckets are probably 60% of their time. They still are spending 40% doing duties as
Yeah.
assigned slash all other things. But the one thing there for me, like which I've seen actually a couple role clarities that are pretty similar on the student parent volunteers, and the fourth one is something along that weekly service or weekly program, and then they just more put those other duties into that 20 or 30% that you come in acknowledging as far as on the role clarity framework. Hey, this is you still have 8 to 12 hours a week that's for those other activities. But one of the things but even there, I think it's a great idea for people to see is the bigger they would want that ministry event to be, the bigger they want that small group ministry to be, or that service, and then Sunday school, there's a direct correlation down of how much people can give to the parents, to the parents, to the volunteers, as the bigger that gets. Or any one of these, as they get bigger, the more it limits the space that a youth leader has to give to the other roles.
Well, I think it's about multiplying yourself, right?
Yeah.
If I have an incredible volunteer who can teach from the stage twice a month, or I have a rotation of volunteers that can teach, which gives me the freedom to only teach once a month. Well,
Yeah.
now those are 3 weeks of not teaching that I can now spend 2 weeks with volunteers, 1 week with parents, right? And so
Yeah.
it's really about multiplying yourself, your giftings, and investing in those volunteers to empower them to do things,
Yeah.
to once again get back to what is it that only you as the youth pastor can do? What is it
Yeah.
only you as the youth director can do? Um, and again, I think this is a mindset shift in churches, because I think there is this mindset. I'm paying James, I'm paying Lee, like they are the guy to do all of these things,
Yes.
and I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's realistic.
Yeah.
Really, what we need is a bunch of leaders who are passionate about multiplying themselves, so that they can continue the work of the kingdom, on into the other spaces, and cast that net further. So I do think that if you spend 20 hours of your week planning for an incredible, huge, and you may do it really well, blowout service on a Wednesday night, great. But now you only have 20 hours to do future planning, to do visioning, to do
Yeah.
volunteer I mean, all of those things. And this is my personal bias, and we can talk about it, but somebody's always going to have a better show than you, is my opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like especially today, somebody's always going to have a better show. And so what is it that I can use my time creating that I can be the best at, that I'm not going to lose
Yeah.
to somebody else? And so
Yeah.
for me, it's always been relational capital, investing there, discipling, leading, multiplying.
Yeah, which I love that. And I think I love, if I was a pastor watching this, I'm having kind of like this aha moment of, if I'm sitting down with these four buckets, I'm talking to a young youth leader who grew up, they're watching YouTube, they're watching these other things, and they think, I got to be the speaker, I've got to be able to draw the crowd. I think it's a great way. I mean, even just the example you gave about finding strong volunteers, building a team, just to show, hey, the more time that you're able to empower other people potentially to fill key elements of this role, the more time that you're doing things that are pretty unique when it comes to students and parents and to the volunteers, and building something that's going to
Yeah.
last, like you said, the foundational for a long time. Because I think that's just, when it's just for me a task list,
Hmm.
I've watched, it's just tough because we've come to these expectations of like, that's just what a youth pastor does. But trying to like lay out these four things where it's like,
Oh man.
there's only 100% to give. I only have 100%. How do you want to
Yeah.
spend it?
Yeah. I think the other piece of it is true too, uh, that the tenure of a youth pastor, I think right now, is 3 years, right? And so if a kid is in sixth, here it's 6th through 8th, and then 9th through 12th, I mean that's three youth pastors in those 3 years. And so if it's built around that youth pastor's persona and their giftings, and it's always them, and they're the superhero, if you will, like those are three very drastic changes,
Yeah.
in that kid's life. Um, Whereas if it's built around volunteers who are, it is their church, it is like they have been there, and like they're the steady, then yes, you have a you need that youth pastor to kind of tie the ends together, and to cast some vision, and to lead the teams, and to do some of those things. But now it's a volunteer who's really doing the life on life pastoring of kids, and they're the consistent. And so that youth
Hmm.
pastor, in theory, with time, should be able to step out and not break relationships or hinder the ministry moving forward, because there are still volunteers who they've set up to continue to run the ministry. If you can't tell, volunteers is my biggest bucket.
No, I love it.
It
I
is.
love.
It's my biggest bucket. I love it. I mean,
Well,
that's where
let's
we
jump
need
in
to
there
spend
for a
our
second,
time.
because you're talking to people that are like, because you and I, like, this can philosophically sound really good, and I can't argue against the philosophy of it. We could go through scripture, we could do all
No.
of that, but I'm still thinking about that person who's making the hire, and I got person A over here, and they can bring it, and they can speak, and they are charismatic off the charts, and I
Yep.
got person B, and they have all the characteristics of a team builder and that relational strength or whatever. What's the challenges you're walking through looking at candidates, looking at, I'm guessing you've seen leaders. Do they struggle with this?
Oh, for sure. All the time. All the time. And so here are the questions that I ask. What are your non-negotiables versus what can you coach? Right?
Good.
Uh,
That's good.
I don't care how charismatic that leader is, how they can draw a crowd, they can teach, they're funny, they're engaging from the stage. If they can't build relationships with kids, if they're a jerk, if they're just not prickly, it,
Yeah.
you can't coach them out of those things. It's just the way they're wired. Whereas I can coach programming, I can coach communication skills, I can coach communication, right? And so uh, that for me, like that personality, that connectiveness, that uh, character, relationship building, all of those things are the things that I don't think you can coach as easily. So that's the first thing that I would
Yeah.
ask is, what can you coach versus what can we not coach? And then the second thing is, your church and the people who are involved. Who can we put around them, right? Is there somebody high energy? Is there somebody who can help lift up and carry some of these other places? And if not, then maybe that is who we need to hire. And then we coach the volunteer recruitment and we find volunteers to help with that. Um, and then, big churches, you just hire multiple people because you have the finances to do that, and God
Yeah.
bless you for doing
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah. Which, oh man, yes. But that, I want to come back because I think to me, you hit on something there. That's just a question that anyone can ask as they're going through this, is because it's just, especially if we're talking to small churches where they can't hire, five
Right.
people for youth. I mean, I remember knowing someone who was like, they were hiring someone to just like play guitar, just handle the guitars in services. Like, it's a very different world
That
than like,
must that must be nice. That must
yes,
be nice.
yes. So I think that's just a great question of, if you're not hiring a superhuman, then you inherently are making a decision. There are some things that are non-negotiable, and then some things that are coachable. I'm just
Yeah.
deciding which of these I want to have to do more coaching on, and which ones I'm like, I'm not doing coaching. If you can't do this, I'm not coaching on this. It's, man, that is a huge question for, I think, about a leadership team or a couple people sitting around having this conversation about a position, just to look maybe at the history of their ministry and to say, hey, we're not good at coaching these things. Like, we're actually good at coaching these. I think even that could potentially
Yeah.
help, just knowing the DNA of your team.
Yeah. And knowing what your team is good at and where they are strong. But I think it's also knowing what parents expect day one.
Yeah.
Because depending on how long they've been without a youth director, youth pastor, they're not going to be as forgiving with some coaching things, right? Um,
Yeah.
Communication, for example, like they don't want to wait 9 months for this person to figure out how to communicate and send an email every week,
Yeah.
right? And so like that, knowing those things are also important to figure out how we can undergird and support this person. What your team is good at, what parents expect, um, because you know, I think you said earlier, like philosophically, this is a great idea, but you need a holistic church on boardness
Yeah.
um, to do this because it is a shift. Because historically, churches have paid a youth director to do this,
Yeah.
and so we have to have that culture shift, which is part of what we do with ministry architects, is helping them realize that sustainability looks like more involvement from volunteers.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's, yeah. Which I love all that. I love the conversation. We could go on, but I want to jump into some more questions. But first, if you're interested in this conversation, maybe you're thinking, what is role clarity all about? How do I clarify the 4 key roles? And this goes to a role clarity revolution framework, which I use to help leaders do this simply and easily. You can check out more at roleclarity.co. I would love to be able to share some of that with you. But now let's get into some questions, kind of the digging deeper questions
okay,
around them. And I
I'm
know we've
in.
covered some of these, but we're going to just go into them again if we haven't fully touched them. What are the most unrealistic expectations that church leaders can have about the youth ministry position and what it looks like to succeed in that position?
Yeah, so a few things come to mind. One, we've talked about that superhero mindset. we're going to make a hire and this person is going to fix everything.
Yeah.
Well, they're not. Uh, let's just be clear, they're not, and nor should they, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's a healthy mindset,
Mhm.
um, and it's not a mindset you want because if they can come in and fix everything, they're going to leave in 3 years, 5 years, and leave you in the same spot you are.
Ooh,
And so, like, it needs to really be this team, church wide, volunteer built parent engagement effort. We can't hire a superhero to do everything. So I think often churches and senior leaders expect the youth ministry to succeed on their own,
mm,
when in reality they're a holistic piece of the larger body. And so often we want to say, well, this youth ministry is not what it was 20 years ago when we had 3 million students. I made that number up, so it was unrealistic, right? But
yes.
we'll go. It wasn't what it was when we had 200 kids. I've heard that one. In the 80s, we had 200 kids and it was awesome. And I'll ask, okay, well, what was the size of the church in the 80s? Oh, well, it was like 5 times our size now. Okay, so the church has shrunk. We're scaling down together,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's so often that we like. Well, of course, it was once great then. Why can't we do that again? Without looking at the larger picture of what's going. How are we funding it? How are we resourcing it? What's the larger church doing? And so there's this expectation that youth pastors and youth directors and staff can grow a ministry without being resourced with what they need, or that would grow outside of what we would say is normal for a church of that size. Now, can a church outgrow what we would say is normal? Yes, it's a norm and not a target, right?
Yeah.
But if I were to walk into a church of 250 and they had 25 kids, I would say that's normal. Now, they may have 30, 40, 50 kids, and I would go, let's celebrate that because you're doing above normal. If they had 10 kids, I would go, okay, well, let's look at the larger system and see what's going on because we would expect a church of this size to have 25 kids. Is it a budgeting issue? Is it a staffing issue? Is it a church? I mean, there are so many different things. And so I think on top of that superhero mindset, so many churches, when they're hiring, want somebody who can grow that ministry without it uh, w- without the rest of the church being affected, or acknowledging the role the rest of the church plays. So those
Yeah.
those are my two things that
Yeah.
I think are unrealistic. The superhero mindset, and youth ministry is its own thing, and we can grow it without addressing the rest of the church. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never thought about it this way. Obviously, I love Patrick Lencioni's work, and he talks about silos. And the thing is, sometimes we're talking about teams, like we can't be silos, but then sometimes I think we can evaluate ministries as silos. And it's just saying, like,
For sure.
this is what we expect of you, this is what it should be. It's like, hey, this is all interconnected. How are we doing feeding youth into that from the children's
Yes.
ministry? How are we doing with all the other areas? Supporting it on a Sunday morning from stage, reinforcing the value of it. Yeah, I think that's a great one of like, it's not fair to like get on to people about not having silos, and when it's convenient to us as leaders to like, hey, we're just evaluating this thing all by itself.
And it happens, and youth pastors get frustrated and they get burned out, and I think that's when these almost expectations of superheroes and siloed evaluation push them to working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, because there's this unrealistic goal that they're being asked to achieve.
Yeah,
And especially if it's their first position, one, they may not know any better, and
yeah,
two, it's this lie of, well, if I can't do it here, am I really built for this? So
yeah,
I'm going to put my nose to the grindstone. I'm going to get it done, even if it kills me.
yeah,
Um, and I just think that's part of the challenge that entry level people
yeah.
into this world face. I think the older you get, the more experience you have, the more you learn, and like you can kind of recognize some of these things, but it takes time.
Well, we won't go super far down this road, but just even this conversation, even preparing and thinking about it, when you have a place, I mean, I think about any other organization in the world where you thought, okay, where do the young leaders that are excited and passionate about what we're doing come in? I mean, the thought is like, we better get them connected and staying, because that's like the future of what probably is going to be these
Yeah.
organizations and our development programs. And to me, I don't live in this world a ton, but man, to see pastors and ministers really say, like, just join together, like, we're going to help these young, especially people in youth
Yeah.
ministry who have that potential, like, to see that we've got to keep them in the pipeline and not burn them out when it's just so dangerous. You're young, you're passionate, sometimes you have more time, you don't have kids yet a lot of times, all the other stuff that happens, and you just build this world that's not, we know is not realistic, especially with age and family and all the stuff that comes up.
Well, then I also think that a lot of people, like I have a physics degree. It was not very helpful in ministry, but a lot of people entering ministry who know they want to do it vocationally either go to Bible college, or after their undergrad they go to seminary before they start their first job, and they come out with all of this head knowledge of things to do, and they get into the real world and go, well, they didn't teach me this, this, and this, and
Yeah.
the way they taught this isn't practical, right? And so it's also about writing those expectations with things that you only get living the life and doing the job. And so I think that hurts young people coming in, is that they get punched in the face, if you will, and all of their training hasn't prepared them for some of the punches they're gonna. It has for some, and I,
Yeah.
I think I think education is important, but I also think there's a very practical piece that we need to balance as we're looking for experience in people and ministries.
Let's flip the coin here.
Okay.
We've kind of been going at churches and church leaders. Let's turn the glass the other way and say, what are
Yeah.
some of the most unrealistic expectations that you see youth ministers having about what it looks like to thrive in their position, or what does it look like to win as a youth minister?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind, and fellow youth pastor here, I'm with you. Like, don't take me out behind the woodshed, beat me up. Hear me out. Like the popular one is numbers don't matter. As long as I'm being faithful and discipling the kids that the Lord has brought me, my ministry size does not matter. And I can't get behind that. Like as a former youth pastor, as a systems guy, I mean, from an organizational standpoint, I can't get behind that. From a staffing standpoint, from a kingdom minded standpoint, like I just it doesn't make sense to me. And I think, now I'll clarify, most people who I hear saying that are pulling a norm from ministry architects, which is that 10% norm, but they're ignoring the other ones. And like they're saying, this is so unrealistic that I'll hit this. They want this number, right? And so like that's what they're looking at. But um, I think if we look at the landscape, we can't ignore numbers. It's a stewardship game. How am I stewarding the students that the Lord has brought, but also the ones that are in the community around me? It's a finance game. Like this church is paying you to do a job and to grow a ministry. And for some churches, they may say, hey, if you have 12 kids, that's great. Some churches may say that we want you to grow a ministry. And like they get to be a part of that conversation because again, they've hired you to do a job. Um,
Mm.
and so the first one for me that I would say is like it's not just about maintaining. It's not just about discipling the ones that you have or investing in a few. Like you're being paid to grow a healthy and sustainable ministry. Now, again, I'm not saying that you have to have 300 kids, because if you're at a church of 300, that's unrealistic, right? Like we need to decide what healthy is and shoot for that. But to be okay just going, well, numbers aren't important. I I may be the unpopular one here, but I think it's a common expectation that youth pastors have that I can't get behind. I mean, I don't know. Challenge me on that. Tell me I'm
Yeah,
wrong. Tell me
yeah.
what you think.
I think for me, what I would, which I mean, I live in a little different world than you do. I think for me, it would be about a conversation with leadership. And I think if the leadership says for us, like we go even, if we look more like even mainline, even non-denominationals that are still a little more of, training kids, discipling them, just, more of these classes they want them to
Yeah,
go through. But I still think of that where I can agree is like, I think there is still a number. There's still some number that and this is what I would ask to a pastor is, or to youth is, so what number shows up in here where like there's going to be a conversation after it happens 3 weeks in a row? We all have a number. Is it 5 kids? Is it 3 kids? There is some point. So we've
yeah,
all agreed there is a number. I think for me, I would want to know, there could be a conversation from a church leader that just says, where we've been, we really, really want to make sure, at least where you start, at least for some first couple years, that you're starting on like the kids that are in this church, the kids, the grandkids, the whatever. And we'd love to see 50% of them being involved in ministry or whatever that would be. And so,
yeah.
yeah, I think think there could be. I think that conversation needs to happen, though. I think the numbers part is what happens is it's not clarified, and I think it needs to be clarified early on in the game, especially if you are somebody who is significant. Of we want to
Yeah.
grow something, we want a couple hundred kids. Like that should not be vague. I think if that's a big deal for a leader, and we know that it is for a number of them, you need to say that. Like you need to be very clear that
Yeah.
that's what success. So a youth pastor coming in understands. So I don't, no, I don't disagree. I do probably think in different context.
Maybe
Like
less of a number, more of defining the win, right?
yes,
Like
I think that yes,
what's the win? And I'll ask churches like, hey, if you had 20 kids meeting off campus in a group every week, but they never set foot on this campus, is that
yeah,
a win? For some churches, they would say yes, and some would say no, right? Like
yeah,
we don't want to count those kids. Okay, well let's define the win. So anyway, I think the first the honest expectation is like
yeah,
numbers, but maybe that win piece of numbers don't matter, wins don't matter. I think the second one, organization. Like I'm gonna have somebody help me with this. If if I'm that charismatic kind of leader that I'm great with kids, the rest of it's gonna fall into place. It'll just come natural. I'll figure it out. And what I tell youth pastors who are not very organized is that, hey, if you want to stay in this game a long time, you need to figure this out because you'll only send so many emails last minute to parents asking for volunteers because you've not planned ahead or to sign up for an event before they stop trusting you. And the same thing with volunteers and in any of that medical release forms, trip planning,
yeah,
finances, budget, like all of those things. Like you need to be proficient in that.
yeah.
You don't need to be awesome, but you can't ignore it, which I think is part of the mindset. Sometimes is I'll wing this and I'll figure it out. I don't think
Yeah.
that's healthy either.
Well, I think that comes from one of those places where, especially if you grew up around youth ministry and you just saw it, like you don't see any of that stuff. You don't see what's going on in the
No,
weekdays when somebody's sitting at their
yeah,
desk doing all that hard grind work. You
oh,
came to the activities and the events and the
yeah,
whatever. And so yeah, I agree. I mean, I think about how many people probably go into youth ministry because they had a youth minister that they looked up to and was
yeah,
like charismatic, came to their school and whatever. But especially the ones that last a long time, rarely do you see them just
yeah.
being just disorganized, last minute. Oh
It's
man,
one of the guys I work with calls it the broccoli of ministry. Nobody really wants to eat it, but you have to be healthy. So yeah, and then I think another one is you talked about most people coming to ministry because they had this charismatic youth pastor, right? And it's this idea of, oh, I've seen it done this way. It's going to work again. Like I can cookie cutter what I know and go somewhere else and completely replicate it. And I just don't think that's different based on geography, group makeup, kind of how long they've been without somebody or with somebody, what the previous person did. I mean, there are so many
yeah,
different pieces there that when you're interviewing, like I always recommend like share your model, share what you're passionate about, and make sure it aligns. Because you may walk in with these expectations that you're going to be able to recruit 30 volunteers and be out in the community doing things, and the church is like, that's not what we want. That's not our win.
yes.
That's
For me, it is. That's the win. Getting clarifying the win, I agree. That's just at the forefront of them. Both people knowing, and I think most leaders don't want to hear this. Church leaders is, I think they struggle to clarify what the win is. I think that's not always a skill that's been developed. Of just say it like this is what it is,
yeah.
um, so that you can go from there.
Again, if you ask the senior pastor, the parent, and the youth, they're going to give you three different wins,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
so it's about bringing them together.
That's good. So, how has it in your experience? How has the position of youth minister changed in the last 15 to 20 years, just based on what you're seeing in churches and also just what
Yeah.
you've seen firsthand?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things in terms of the role itself and youth ministry and kind of what this role is doing. Um, we walk into churches and we hear, well, we're not like anybody else. Like our families are really busy. And what we tell them is, well, you're like exactly everybody else. Everybody is busy. Like kids are
Yeah,
playing three or four sports. They're in all of these clubs. They're working, and multiple families. Both parents work. Like so, in the last 15 to 20 years, like that's been a drastic shift. And so, youth ministries and churches have had to change how they execute to meet those families' needs, because you're competing against more things than ever before. And so, I think that's where when you do programming, how you do programming, the purpose of programming, like all of those things now, the win, if we talk about like all of those things are now customized to your church because again, everybody's busy. And so we have to figure out how we get your church's win partnered with the busyness of those people. So I think that's a big change. My response to that is you're not going to have the best show. But again, back to volunteers and leaders and relationships. And so I think if you can give kids quality relationships where they know they're loved and valued, then I think you're going to win in that area more often than you lose. And then I think in terms of the hiring piece, in real estate, there's a buyer's market and there's a seller's market. Right now, we are in a searcher's market. Um,
The searcher, the
Everybody,
church searcher, or the
no,
person looking for a job?
the candidate. It is a
The
candidate's
candidates.
market. Oh
Okay.
yeah, they are playing, and you know, rightfully so or not. Like they're playing offers versus each other. They all have multiple. I mean, the good ones, if they're good, they have multiple offers out there that they can really kind of negotiate back and forth, and that's just the world we're in. I think
Wow.
coming out of the pandemic, um, I think there are a lot of factors that lead into this burnout, frustration, unrealistic expectations, defined wins, even further up the food chain or the org chart, if you will. Um, People are leaving the ministry and they're leaving holes. I was talking to a denominational leader in North Carolina last weekend, and he estimates right now there are 400 Baptist churches without a senior pastor in North Carolina alone, and that number is going to continue to grow. And so there are fewer candidates trying to fill 400 positions. They're getting offers, and if your church isn't ready to play in the big leagues and put your best foot forward, maybe not financially, but health wise, organization wise, there are other things that you can do. You're not the only game in town right now, like it used to be, where there were 1,000 people getting out of Bible college every year looking for jobs, and you
Yeah.
had your pick of them because jobs were scarce. There's a lot of jobs out there right now. Um, the last three searches I've done, every candidate that I've presented to a team had other offers, and multiple teams lost candidates to other jobs. They like would bring candidates on site, and they would go, "Okay, I'm visiting." It's like college visits, like for football. I'm here now. I'm going to California next week. I'm going to Texas, and they lose candidates to other jobs. Um, it's crazy. It is the wild wild west of hiring out there right now.
I think that's so interesting because you hear that stuff, but to hear someone like on the front lines of like
Oh man,
I'm interacting with it, I'm watching it. I think there's one thing too. You said 15, 20 years ago. As I look about everything you said, I actually grew up part of my life in a youth pastor's home, and so I think what's so interesting is that still some of the fundamentals of like great youth ministry are. It's so funny. Volunteers, like great volunteer teams, great relationships. But I think the one thing you said that is different is when I grew up, I mean, basically everybody who had a youth ministry, they all kind of looked the same. We all had church on Wednesday night. We all went to youth
yeah,
camp. There's just like a checklist. And to me, I think that's what's so different. One of the things that I see so different now is, just even in a small town, big town, just how youth ministries, what that looks like, the models, the frameworks that they're using. They can be vastly different from a only small group to once a month mega service. It's just and everywhere in
yeah.
between.
I think I think for me, like that's exciting,
Yeah,
right? Like it shows me that ministries are responding to their people, to their culture, and to their neighborhood,
that's a good idea.
as
Good point.
opposed to trying to force something on it. Like, hey, this works for me to meet the needs of my people and to do it well, so we're going to do it this way. Um, and just the creativity in that, the kingdom mindedness, and it also makes my job fun because I get to problem solve all these 1,000 different ways with churches and to
There we
help
go.
them dream, right? And that's what I love to do.
Okay, which kind of swings us right into our final question. If I'm a leader watching this, I'm like, great, James. If I can pay enough money, then I can get a great candidate. So let's go a different direction. Outside
Yeah.
of compensation, this could be somebody who's maybe they can't even bring on a full-time youth minister or they're just a smaller church. What can church leaders do to create youth ministry positions that attract great candidates, especially in terms of the roles they expect, the development they're going to provide? What can they do outside of the compensation game?
Yeah. So I was talking with a buddy the other day, and his executive pastor walked in and said, "Hey, if you weren't on staff here, would you attend this church? Which is like, that's a crazy question to ask. And so I think outside of compensation, I would say build the organization that you'd want to be a part of if money wasn't an issue, right? Like, would you volunteer in this church? Would you serve? Would you, if they weren't paying you, would you still attend here? uh, People who are looking for jobs right now, they want a healthy staff. They want to know why the last person left. They want to know what the climate is. They want to know what it's like to work on the team. And so if your team is dysfunctional, if your team is if there's tension there, if there's unspoken things, like that's not attractive. But if you can fix those things and be healthy and be a team and be a family, I personally would take less money to be in a healthy environment than more money to be in an environment that's going to run me ragged with no boundaries and that is just full of unhealthy and expectations. So I think that's one. I think writing expectations, writing the ship. I think is another one. We use the analogy of a dance floor. And so the idea is this, that you can have the best ballerina in the world. And if they're dancing on a dance floor with a huge hole in it, it's only a matter of time before they get hurt and you replace them with a new dancer. And until you repair that hole in the dance floor, then no matter who you put on it is going to end up becoming hurt and not useful to you, and you're going to replace them. And so show the candidates that you've done the hard work of making sure the ministry is healthy and sustainable and ready for them to walk in and succeed. They're not going to have to fight for time to tell stories. They're not going to have to fight for time to recruit volunteers. They're not going to have to fight for, basic, not extravagant, but basic budget needs. Show them that you are set up for success and that you just want to come in and support them. So your org is good, your staff is good, your church is healthy, and then the dance floor is ready to go. And then for me, this is a personal one. I don't know how important it is. I want you to capture my heart with vision. Yeah. Right? Like, where are we going and how are we going to get there? What do I get to be a part of in this journey of where we're going? And so I think those are some things that I'm not going to say they're easy, but they're not. You're not competing with the church down the road to up compensation by $10,000 plus provide benefits plus this and that. Like, those are things that you can take care of internally to get yourself ready to hire somebody.
I think that's so good. I think it's just a great thought for when you can feel helpless in leadership along the way. As long as I'm building a healthier team, clarifying that vision to where it is succinct and it's not just this vague vision that everybody seems to say the same thing, is I'm doing all the pieces that when that position does come up, when this person moves on somewhere else for good reasons or whatever it may be, or they just grow up in our organization, I'm ready to really recruit somebody who's going to thrive and that wants to be here.
Yeah, so I think it comes down to stewarding the process well. And that's what I tell churches. The reality is the Lord is bigger than this empty position, and the Lord loves those students more than you ever will. And he is still on the throne. He is still God. And ultimately, because he's God, he knows who's going to be in this position. Our job is to steward the process well. And if we can steward the process well, then James has faith that we're going to land the right person for this job in the right season. The Lord's bigger than compensation. The Lord's bigger than experience. And again, he loves those kids more than we do. And so our job is to steward it well. And stewarding it well means taking care of those things: org chart, dance floor, expectations.
That's awesome.
So that's my soapbox.
I love it, James. Literally, this has been one of just a blast of a conversation. Like, sometimes, you book something here for us. It's lunchtime right now.
Yeah.
And I'm like more awake now than I was when we started. So, man, thanks for making this such a fun conversation. So people wanting to know more about ministry architects or your work specifically, what's the best way for them to learn more?
Yeah, I love to talk, obviously, conversations like this. And so the easiest thing to do is just email me and tell me all the things that I said wrong today or all the things that I said right. Or I just ask any clarifying questions.
Yes.
And they can do that. James.warren, WARREN, at ministryarchitects.com. I would love to have conversations, set up a time, if I can be helpful from systems to, kicking around some of this stuff as you hire or are looking to hire. I'd love to just give you some time and see how I can be helpful to you in your journey.
I love it. And I will add your email to the description too, as far as on the YouTube,
Awesome.
those type of things. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward. I'm guessing we will have more conversations in the future because this one's been a blast. So thanks for coming along.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day. Be blessed.
Yes. So if you're wanting to know more about Role Clarity, check out roleclarity.co, roleclarity.co. You can also subscribe here to the YouTube channel, check out the videos, do all of the things. Much like James said, I'm here to serve and to help. And so there's a way for me to help in terms of understanding role clarity or strengthening your team by clarifying the roles and what it is you expect and building those strong teams. I would love to do that. And we'll see you next time.